The unmade movie. It's a concept that goes back to the golden age of cinema. Some ideas good and some bad. Perhaps in an ideal world, where creativity is unrestrained by reality, every one of these unmade projects would have been completed. One of the most interesting of all these unrealized ideas, however, comes from Stanley Kubrick. Generally considered to be one of the finest directors in the history of the silver screen, Kubrick was noted for his incredible versatility. His filmography covers science fiction, satire, and even horror, but never will we know how he might have tackled the historical biopic. Never will we see Kubrick's planned adaptation of the life of the iconic French emperor and military leader, Napoleon Bonaparte.
Napoleon was born at Ajaccio in Corsica on August 15, 1769. He had not been a healthy baby, and his mother Letizia lavished him with care and devotion. In middle age, he would write about her from St. Helena. "My mother has always loved me. She would do anything for me."
Stanley Kubrick was born on the 26th of July, 1928 in Manhattan, New York. While at school, his IQ was discovered to be above average. However, he had a poor attendance record and would often skip school to watch double feature movies. Despite this apparent lack of interest in academia, he displayed a fascination with literature from a young age and was particularly drawn to Greek and Roman myths and the fables of the Grimm brothers. According to Kubrick biographer John Baxter, this instilled in him a lifelong affinity with Europe. Another notable passion of the young Kubrick was chess, which was taught to him by his father at age 12 and remained a lifelong interest. Kubrick would go on to say that chess helped him to develop patience and discipline in making decisions. At age 13, Kubrick's father was responsible for sparking another notable interest in his son by buying him a camera. Kubrick would go on to befriend a neighbor who had his own darkroom, and the two would spend hours indulging in still photography. During his time at William Howard Taft High School from 1941 to 45, Kubrick would become an official school photographer, and after leaving school, following a brief stint at attending evening classes at the City College of New York, he began selling his photos to Look magazine. His first set of photos were published in the 26th of June 1945 issue, and he would soon become full-time staff photographer. Still many years away from becoming a master of filmmaking, G. Warren Schlote Jr., a fellow colleague at Look, recalled that he thought Kubrick lacked the personality to thrive in Hollywood. He later remarked, "Stanley was a quiet fellow. He didn't say much. He was thin, skinny, and kind of poor, like we all were." It wasn't until 1948 when Kubrick would finally begin discovering the interest in which the rest of his career would be based on: movies. He would begin frequenting cinemas and found himself inspired by directors like Sergei Eisenstein and Elia Kazan, and spent hours reading books on film theory. Using some of this knowledge, Kubrick would go on to direct two short documentaries in 1951 called Day of the Fight and Flying Padre. Sometime after this, Kubrick decided to take a gamble and quit his job at Look to become a professional filmmaker. In 1953, with loans from friends and family, he managed to direct his first full-length film, Fear and Desire. Despite doing poorly at the box office, it did garner some attention from critics at the time, and following its release, Kubrick would make two low-budget noirs, Killer's Kiss in 1955 and The Killing in 1956, both of which were a modest commercial success. After catching the attention of major Hollywood star Kirk Douglas, Kubrick would finally direct his first big-budget film with 1957's Paths of Glory. Despite only being a modest financial success, today, Paths of Glory is regarded as the movie in which Kubrick finally found his footing. It was nominated for numerous awards and was generally praised by most critics at the time. By the 1960s, Kubrick was regularly directing films to critical and commercial success. These included the lavish sword and sandal epic Spartacus, the controversial and darkly comic Lolita, the biting Cold War satire Dr. Strangelove, and finally, the groundbreaking science fiction classic 2001: A Space Odyssey. And following the release of 2001 in 1968, Kubrick decided that the next subject that he wished to dramatize would be Napoleon. Although it's unknown when Kubrick's interest in Napoleon sparked, by the time he was wrapping up production on 2001: A Space Odyssey in summer 1967, he was using a sketchbook to brainstorm ideas on what the contents of his Napoleon movie would be. How could he breathe new life into a man whose life had been adapted since the earliest days of silent cinema? Kubrick, always the innovator, believed that it could be done, claiming that most of these efforts were poor and failed to capture the spirit of Napoleon as a man. Film historian John Toulard once stated that Napoleon, with his large hat, frock coat, and hand permanently tucked into his waistcoat, arguably crafted his own screen image decades before the invention of the cinema. And with so many previous dramatizations of his life failing to look beyond this, Kubrick's desire to make his mark on the story of the French Emperor could be seen as an effort to paint a more realistic portrait than what had previously been shown on the screen. Kubrick envisioned Napoleon as a man who was undeniably charismatic, but also a power-hungry despot who betrayed millions and would write in his notebook, "I don't claim Napoleon is the best and most honourable man in history, only the most interesting." A key aspect which Kubrick wanted to touch on was Napoleon's inner psychology, which contrasted with many previous Napoleon films, which had focused primarily on his many military feats. While Kubrick did of course not want to shy away from showing battle scenes, he envisioned a movie that was both an intimate character study as well as a sweeping epic. Action would not be there for action's sake. Kubrick also wanted to cover Napoleon's love life, an aspect that might have previously been viewed as controversial due to the strict ratings codes which dictated what could be shown on film prior to the late 1960s. In a 1972 interview for Sight and Sound magazine, Kubrick said, "You have to get a feeling of what it was like to be with Napoleon, and at the same time you have to convey enough historical information in an intelligent, interesting, concise way so that the audience understands what happened." In addition to Kubrick's desire to improve on what he considered previous failures in the genre, the story of Napoleon in many ways encompassed themes that are prevalent throughout his filmography. His brother-in-law and occasional producer on his films, Jan Harlan, later stated, "One of Stanley's often repeated notions was that we are all driven by our irrational emotions, and in Napoleon he would have shown us the glory and frailty of mankind through this charismatic leader with unparalleled gifts. A man who was both worshipped and genuinely loved himself, but who, constrained by his own arrogance, brought about his own downfall." Following the release of 2001: A Space Odyssey in 1968, Kubrick could at last dedicate his time wholly to the Napoleon project and would spend countless hours consuming information about the man from a variety of mediums. Previous movies to see what had been done before, period paintings to get a good indication of the look of the Napoleonic era, and books to ensure that an almost total degree of historical accuracy could be achieved, with only a few subtle instances of artistic liberty. Kubrick said, "I must have destroyed every art book that you can buy in the bookshop by tearing out the pages and sorting through them. I created a picture file of thousands of drawings and paintings, and it's a fun problem to overcome, having to learn something from these old works to make something new. While Kubrick concentrated on the historical aspects of the project, he sent his assistants abroad to find areas where the movie could be filmed. While Kubrick had ideally wanted to film in some of the actual historical locations, he doubted that he would be granted permission to do so. He had also wanted to film on actual Napoleonic battlefields, but much of the land had been taken over by industrial and urban development, and thus he accepted the likelihood of having to compromise. By the end of the location scouting, however, numerous alternatives were considered, including parts of England, Romania, Belgium, Yugoslavia, France, and Italy. Kubrick was even brought back a sample of the Earth at Waterloo. The end result of this grueling research was the amassing of around 17,000 images full of visual representation of Napoleon's lifetime, and a private library of over 500 books detailing Napoleon's political testament, the memoirs of people who knew him, academic studies, and various biographies. Of all these many resources, however, the main source of information was Felix Markham of Oxford University's 1963 biography, simply entitled Napoleon. Kubrick's personal copy of the book, which still exists today, is heavily annotated with the essential ideas of what would become the first draft screenplay of the film. While Kubrick also enlisted the help of a few other historians, it was Markham, due to his reputation as one of the world's leading experts on Napoleon, who would become Kubrick's personal advisor on all historical issues that would inevitably surround the film. Markham and Kubrick would begin a long correspondence discussing all aspects of Napoleon's life, from the types of horseshoes used in Napoleon's Russian campaign to the type of English-speaking accent that could be adapted as an equivalent substitute for characters that had non-English speaking accents. For example, Markham suggested that the characters of Corsican origin could possibly speak with Scottish accents in the movie, as the Corsicans were often compared to Highlanders during the 18th century. Such vast amounts of material would of course have to be compiled in an easily accessible way. Kubrick, much like Napoleon himself, was always fond of devising new organisation techniques, and so conceived the idea of using a card index system. Written on the numerous cards would be the daily activity of all the historical figures that would be depicted in the film on nearly every day of their lives. Compiling and arranging of the material was assembled by a team of Oxford history graduates, resulting in what Dejan Sujic, co-curator of the Stanley Kubrick exhibition, called an analog Wikipedia. By early 1969, Kubrick had, in his own words, totally immersed himself in the life of Napoleon, and he would even begin jotting down how he would have averted some of the issues that led to Napoleon's downfall. The results of some of these reflections can also be seen in the draft scripts.
Had Marshal Grouchy maintained aggressive contact with the retreating Prussians, they would have been prevented from entering the battle. Having failed to do this, if he had marched his 34,000 men to the sound of the guns, he would have increased Napoleon's army by 50% and might have ensured a French victory. But this was not to be, and Grouchy's inadequacies would be the ruin of Napoleon's last battle.
By late 1968, Kubrick was beginning to more seriously consider how he would tackle issues linked to the final filming, having now completed much of his historical research. Who to cast? What would the environments and costumes look like? With casting, Kubrick had considered a number of actors for the title role, from Oscar Werner to David Hemmings and even Jack Nicholson. For Napoleon's first wife, Josephine, Kubrick had only really wanted Audrey Hepburn. Unfortunately, however, this was not to be, as she had decided to take a break from acting during this time. It's unknown who else he might have considered. For some of the supporting roles, Kubrick considered using several classically trained British theatrical knights, including Alec Guinness, Peter O'Toole, and Peter Ustinov, who he had previously worked with on Spartacus. Numerous technical aspects of the film were also now being considered. To save money on travelling and location expenses, for example, Kubrick had suggested using front projection and stated that it would be both economical and still look as good as if he had taken an entire crew to the actual location. He had had a good experience with this technique on 2001 and noted that the entire Dawn of Man sequence at the beginning of that film was done this way, saving MGM around $750,000 that would have otherwise been spent on travel and location expenses for the cast and crew. Despite Kubrick's desire to appear reasonable in his budgeting to MGM, he nevertheless was still keen to ensure that Napoleon retained the same visual splendor that his other films were known for. Kubrick had recently become obsessed with the idea of filming with natural light in order to create an atmosphere more accurate to the historical period. Kubrick stated, "Atmosphere is very important in historical films. I've found that usually in period films, the lighting in interiors is so false. When you have an interior lit entirely by candlelight, it's not only more authentic to the time, but it looks beautiful too." In order to do this, Kubrick had the idea of shooting with a fast camera lens and wanted to use the then newly developed Zeiss 50mm camera lens to achieve this effect. The lens had originally been designed for NASA to capture the dark side of the moon in 1966, and Kubrick would eventually get to use this lens to a great effect in his 1975 film, Barry Lyndon. Another serious question was where Kubrick would find the numerous men needed for the battle scenes. Of this aspect, Kubrick was very single-minded about what he wanted, stating, "I wouldn't want to fake it with fewer troops because Napoleonic battles were out in the open. A vast tableau where the formations moved in an almost choreographed fashion. I want to capture this reality on film, and to do so it's necessary to recreate all the conditions of the battles with painstaking accuracy." Rather than use extras, Kubrick decided to employ real armies. Troops from the Romanian army, which had offered to provide 30,000 troops at $2 per minute, and troops from the Yugoslavian army, which had offered the same number of troops at $5 per soldier. In the film, battle scenes would use a combination of fight sequences and animated maps to show the tactics which would have been used. A financial danger with using so many people was providing costumes. Often considered to be one of the most expensive aspects of making a historical film, Kubrick was able to solve this issue by deciding to use a number of specially made facsimile costumes that could be made from paper. Kubrick had managed to find a New York firm who had offered to produce them on a fire and waterproof fabric at a cost of $1 to $4 per costume, while principal characters and soldiers close to the camera could wear standard fabric clothing. Background soldiers could wear the paper ones. 2001 had taken 3 years to make, with 6 months for preparation, 4.5 months for filming scenes with the actors, and a 1.5 years for filming the special effects. Kubrick had hoped that Napoleon could be made in considerably less time, and wanted to spend only 2 to 3 months filming battles and location shots, which would have to be done outdoors, and follow this up with an additional 3 to 4 months on indoor scenes, which could be done in a studio. All seemed to be going to plan, and Kubrick's final draft screenplay was completed in September 1969, but just when it seemed that the start of filming was imminent, the project began to fall apart. The late 1960s were a time of radical change for American cinema. The new generation of directors were beginning to enter the film industry, and had started using it to tell more urban, contemporary stories that mirrored the general discontent that the public were feeling towards the American government at the time. Having experienced a gradual decline in popularity throughout the new decade with the arrival of television, major studios realized that they could win back the young generation, resulting in the release of films that were grittier than what could be shown on television, to great critical and commercial success. Because of this changing climate in the film industry, however, 1969 could perhaps not have been a worse time for Kubrick to begin looking to secure funding for a period film. While he would now have to worry less about censorship from the ratings code, the problem lay in the subject of his film. Historical epics, which had previously been a good source of revenue throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, were now beginning to go out of style. Despite Kubrick's best efforts to pitch his film as almost contemporary in its themes of the responsibilities and abuses of power, the dynamics of social revolution, and the nature of militarism, all that producers could see was an outdated and potentially unprofitable historical epic. MGM was unfortunately in a poor financial state at the time, having produced too many box office bombs. They would spend much of the 1970s financing less productions than before, and never again would they be as powerful a studio as they once were. As a result of this, Kubrick would amicably end his long relationship with the studio and instead go to United Artists. However, negotiations would again fall apart there too. While Kubrick had a good reputation in Hollywood for not going over his allocated budgets and for working to tight schedules, Napoleon's estimated production cost of $5 million was simply deemed too expensive by most producers. The straw that broke the camel's back would come in 1970 with the release of Russian director Sergei Bondarchuk's movie Waterloo, which was made in partnership with Paramount Pictures. The rival Napoleon production had been known to Kubrick since the beginning of his own pre-production, but he didn't see it as a cause for concern as the two films had very different approaches to depicting Napoleon. Kubrick had intended for a more ambitious cradle-to-grave adaptation of Napoleon's life. Bondarchuk, however, chose to only cover Napoleon's final demise in the Battle of Waterloo. MGM had other ideas, however, and fear of two movies being released around the same time about a similar topic might have further influenced their decision to back out of funding Kubrick's film. Had Waterloo been a financial success, Kubrick might have been able to pitch Napoleon to studios again and successfully secure backing, but the film was one of the most expensive ever made at the time, and its box office disaster ultimately killed any amount of small interest that Kubrick's project might have previously received. Praised for its historical accuracy in depicting the battle, but criticized for its lack of an engaging plot, Kubrick was unimpressed with Bondarchuk's effort. Kubrick decided that it would be best to let some time pass before dusting off his Napoleon project again, and in the meantime, began work on a project that could be made both cheaper and quicker than Napoleon for Warner Brothers. The result of this was the controversial 1971 film, A Clockwork Orange. After 1972, Kubrick realised that making Napoleon was unlikely to happen, yet the itch of making a historical film still plagued him throughout this period of his life. He began to look for other historical subjects that he could cover from a similar time period, and that brought him to the work of acclaimed Victorian writer William Makepeace Thackeray. After reading Thackeray's 1848 novel, Vanity Fair, which was set during the Napoleonic Wars but from the perspective of the English, Kubrick thought that he had finally found the material for his next film, but after some thought, decided that a film adaptation of the book would be too condensed to do the work justice. He then considered another lesser-known Thackeray book, The Luck of Barry Lyndon, set 15 to 20 years before the Napoleonic Wars. At last, Kubrick knew he had found the source material for his period film. Being of a smaller scale in its story, Kubrick was this time successful in securing financial backing from Warner Brothers. When making Barry Lyndon, Kubrick was able to reuse many ideas that he had previously had for Napoleon, including the idea of filming in natural light, which can be seen in numerous scenes lit entirely by candles. There are even a few visuals from the film that are echoed in the Napoleon script. Released in 1975 to mixed reviews and small commercial success, Barry Lyndon would later be seen by many as one of the director's best and most overlooked films. Having now fulfilled the desire to make a meticulous historical film, Kubrick's final three films would be of a more commercial nature. The classic 1980 horror film The Shining, the 1987 Vietnam War film Full Metal Jacket, and his last film, the 1999 psychological drama Eyes Wide Shut, all of which were far greater financial successes. Kubrick would continue to collect various books about Napoleon throughout his life, and in a 1980 interview said, "It would be nice to do it as a 20-hour TV series, but there is, as yet, not enough money available in TV to properly budget such a venture." Still decades away from the arrival of prestige television, this did not happen in Kubrick's lifetime. Stanley Kubrick died on the 7th of March 1999, shortly after completing his work on Eyes Wide Shut, and still with another movie in pre-production, AI, a science fiction retelling of Pinocchio, which was completed by his friend and fellow director Steven Spielberg and released in 2001. As was the case with AI, there has been talk for many years for someone else to film Kubrick's Napoleon script, with Spielberg possibly serving as a producer for a mini-series based on it. Numerous names floated around throughout the 2010s for the directing job, but the most prominently mentioned one has been that of Cary Fukunaga. Time will only tell if Kubrick's fabled script is able to find a new life, or maybe it already achieved that in a more subtle way with Barry Lyndon.
Napoleon died on May 5, 1821. Hudson Lowe insisted the inscription on the tomb should read, Napoleon Bonaparte. Montthorne and Bertrand refused anything but the imperial title, Napoleon. In the end, it was left nameless.